All right, government students, welcome to Unit 2 of my government class. This is where we're going to deal with constitutional principles, mostly focusing on checks and balances and the separation of powers. All right, so we're going to look at a couple of different things here. We're going to be looking at how the Constitution goes about limiting the power of government and what some of the different types of power are within the Constitution. So the overriding principle that is found in the U.S. Constitution is that the power of government, whether that should be the national level, the local level, or the state level, it should be limited in some way. The government can't just do what it wants. James Madison says this in Federalist 47 really well when he says that the accumulation of all powers, whether they be legislative, executive, or judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, whether it's saying just one person, being like a king, or an executive, a few, meaning like a ruling class, or in the many, meaning the whole population, could maybe justly pronounce the very definition of tyranny, right? That we shouldn't have all of those things together, that we should in some way limit the power of government, okay? But how we go about that? How do we start to balance power in government when it's doing what it's supposed to do, right? Well, these are all the different ways that the Constitution limits the power of government. We have federalism, separation of powers, checks and balances, civil liberties, rule of law, judicial review, and popular sovereignty. We'll briefly cover all of these today, and some of the other days in class we'll go into a little bit more detail with what some of these things are. So let's start off with separation of powers. Okay? Separation of powers is essentially this principle that all executive, legislative, and judicial power should be divided up amongst three independent and co-equal branches of government. Now, that doesn't mean that they have the same amount of power, okay? That they have, or even the same types of power, but rather it's that they all have different types. Okay, that they want, like the legislative branch is going to be primarily responsible for. Legislative power is the power to make laws, right? Executive power is the power to enforce laws. Judicial power is the power to interpret. So by doing all of those different things and dividing up the power that way, it's going to limit the power of government because each branch is going to want to retain control over their specific type of power. All right. So that's the idea behind separation of powers. And that what it does, it leads us to the idea of express powers in the Constitution. These are powers that are directly given to the national government, and they are spelled out directly in the Constitution. A lot of times you might hear this also called enumerated powers. For the purpose of this class, we'll talk of it just as express powers. Okay? You can find these for Congress in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. And this is basically like a short list of many of them, okay? And there's a lot of them. But Article 1, Section 8 is where you want to go for that. Regulating trade is the most powerful power of Congress. And we'll have an activity that we'll do in class that will help show that a little bit more. All right? But Article 1, Section 8 is where you're going to find the express powers of Congress. But as a part of Article 1, Section 8, you also have another type of power that gets added, and that's implied powers. These are powers that are delegated to the national government that are necessary and proper to carry out these express powers. This is through something called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And really what this does is it kind of expands the express powers in the way that if it's related to carrying out one of those express powers, then Congress is going to be able to do that, right? Because it's necessary and proper for carrying out those expressed powers. For example, one I like to use is taxes, right? We all hate taxes, but the problem is if you don't pay your taxes, the federal government's going to come after you, right? We call that something called tax evasion. Well, there's no power in the Constitution that says the federal government can punish you for not paying your taxes. However, because of the necessary and proper clause, it does allow them, because it's necessary and proper to them, for them to tax you, or they have the power to tax, and it's necessary and proper to be able to make sure that you pay your taxes, that they can come after you. Okay? So it's a power related to one of their express powers. Okay? In the executive branch, we're going to find those in Article 2, Section 2. And they have a number of different ones here. You have war powers, administrative powers, judicial powers, shaping foreign policy powers, appointment power, and the power to fill vacancies. We'll cover these a lot more in detail in a couple lessons, but just know that for the purposes of right now, executive power is found in Article 2, Section 2. So for Congress, that's Article 1, Section 8. Executive power for the executive branch, Article 2, Section 2. Right? And that leads us to judicial powers. Judicial powers really, they don't have that much. There isn't really anything that's spelled out in in the U.S. Constitution itself as to what the judicial branch can do. It's very much left up to Congress to kind of uh, flush out some of those ideas and what they do. So Article 3, Section 1 kind of lays out the structure of the court. One of the judicial power is the lifetime appointment of judges that's in there, as it has been traditionally read and understood. We'll take more look at that in a couple lessons when we look at the judicial branch. And there's also, it lays out the jurisdiction of the courts. And jurisdiction really is the authority to hear a particular case. So like in federal law, you have a couple different courts that can hear different types of cases. So your normal cases would be held by the district level, but there's a couple of places when it comes to like dealing with ambassadors and other questions where it goes right to the Supreme Court. And that's really where you get issues of jurisdiction. Next up, checks and balances. This is, I think, is really, really critical to understand how it limits government, because checks and balances are essentially a system of overlapping powers of the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It really allows each branch to keep the other branches in check. It gives them a little bit of control over other branches' responsibilities. Okay? Biggest example of that everybody seems to know, Congress is responsible for making laws, right? Legislative power is the power to make laws. The legislative branch makes the laws. However, the president, if he doesn't like a law or if he doesn't feel that is a good idea, he can veto it. So this is an essential check on that lawmaking process. Or if he does like it, he can go ahead and sign it into law. So that's checks and balances. Federalism. Okay, federalism, we've talked about this a lot even in Unit 1. It's that division of power between a national government and state governments. Okay, here I've got a picture of my wedding over here. Is my lovely wife. There's me, some of my friends, got our lightsabers out, because I'm a huge Star Wars nerd after all. So of course that gets thrown into my wedding. But in certain areas, okay, the national government doesn't really have that much of a say. It's left up to the states. Okay, weddings, right, and marriage laws, for the most part, have been left up to the state. So if you eventually decide to get married to someone, okay, you're going to have to go through your county and basically kind of get a marriage license from your county, and that gets passed on to the states. So that's a issue of state power, and we can look at a few other differences or examples of this as we move forward later on in class. Okay. And that brings us to two other types of power here. We have reserve powers. Okay, this comes from the 10th Amendment. That's any powers that are not expressly granted to the national government are reserved for the states. Okay? So a lot of things are going to be handled by state governments, and it's going to vary from state to state. That's where federalism kind of gets confusing. But you also have concurrent powers. You have things that the national government's going to have to be able to do, as well as the state governments. Things like the power to tax, to be able to regulate banks, to pass laws. Things like that are going to be considered concurrent powers. And again, when we get to federalism, we'll talk more about what those things are specifically. A review of an idea here, popular sovereignty, right? Popular sovereignty is that a government exists only with the consent of the governed. That means that the people are the ultimate authority, and really this is all about voting. Okay? This is talking about about citizens of the United States being able to vote and choose our representatives. That is how we exercise our popular sovereignty. Okay, next up is civil liberties. Civil liberties guarantee the safety of a person, our opinions, and the property from arbitrary acts of the government. Arbitrary being kind of just like little things keep just eroding away at a foundation or something like that. So the government can't just simply pass a law restricting our rights and our freedoms. There are specific instances that they may be able to do that. You can't go ahead and yell fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire and expect to be able to go away without punishment. Okay? But it's going to be a very, very difficult thing to do to be able to restrict your rights in some way. Okay? And the Bill of Rights are great examples of civil liberties, things like freedom of speech, religion, the right to bear arms, and a lot of your criminal rights. That, again, we'll get into those in a couple of units here. I believe that's Unit 4 for us. Okay? That brings us next up to judicial review. This is a really, really important one. It's also one that's not actually in the Constitution at all. It was an idea that was widely accepted at the time of writing the Constitution, but they never actually included the power in it. Okay, this really gets established by a case by the name of Marbury v. Madison in 1803. So still like pretty early in our history. We're not talking super long into it, but all right, the power of judicial review is so important, especially when it comes to protecting rights and ensuring that the government is doing what it's supposed to do. Because what this means is essentially judges, federal judges, have the ability to look at actions by the federal government and determine that they're unconstitutional, that they are in some way violating the Constitution, and as a result of that, that particular act, whether it's a law, an executive order, whatever it is therefore invalid. Okay? This doesn't mean that it's just going away entirely. It's going to have to go all the way to the Supreme Court before something like that is finally determined, before it's really final. But it's designed to try and protect people from government encroaching on things like life, liberty, property. There's my boy John Locke once again. Okay. And again, when we get to the judicial branch, we'll look a little bit more into this. Okay? That leaves up next rule of law. Okay? Rule of law is the last of the concepts that we're going to cover. And this concept really is the idea that everybody has to obey the law. That includes government officials and its officers. You can't just simply do whatever you want. The president can't just go and murder somebody on the streets and expect to be able to not be held accountable for that. Like, yeah, the president should be held accountable. There is a process sometimes with certain government officials as to how they can be held accountable. The president has some executive protections, for example, where he can't be charged with a crime while he's in office, but Congress does have the ability to remove him from office, and then he can be charged with a crime. Okay, so that's an example of that, and also like impeachment itself, impeachment of federal officials, not just the president, but of any federal official, is a process that helps them to helps our government to maintain the rule of law, that everybody has to obey the law. Okay? And we've had 3 presidents who've been impeached here so far. Johnson, that's Johnson after Lincoln is assassinated, Clinton, and then Trump was impeached twice. Okay? That's everything we've got for this set of virtual notes. Try to make it as quick as I could, but we've got a lot to cover yet. So make sure you are ready to go for government for class with these notes, and I will see you in class.